just said, do you, and what you said earlier about the US productivity greatly increasing over relative to the UK and Europe, I mean, do you think the lack of public investment under the coalition was perhaps part of that issue?
Well, I won't get back into all the kind of arguments at the time. Yeah. We thought we were increasing public investment off the plans that Alistair Darling had left us and made a big deal of that, but it was an overall reduction. So we were saying we're doing more than the Labour government was going to do, but the overall impact was a reduction in public investment as part of an overall reduction in public expenditure after the financial crash. I think there are definitely things, road schemes and the like, we actually came back to. Like, we cancelled on arrival the A303 Stonehenge tunnel through John Glenn's constituency, or nearby anyway. And then 2 years later we reinstated it. And then Rachel Reeves cancelled it in the first month.
The traffic jams continue.
So there are definitely kind of yo-yo things. I would say generally I found as Chancellor the frustration was actually a lack of big projects to invest in. I was sort of demanding, where's the Transpennine rail link we can invest in? Where's the, some of the big ideas? Where's Crossrail 2? And I look back
on... My constituency.
But, interesting, on the very first day I was Chancellor, the Treasury said, why didn't you cancel the Elizabeth line because it's not built yet and no one's going to notice it not being there. And every time I travel on it, I go, thank God we didn't cancel the Elizabeth line.
Sorry, you made a very interesting point there about the lack of projects to invest in, which is quite interesting, just given the negative real interest rates you experienced at the time. I mean, was that a key missed opportunity to invest, or was that more a lack of projects?
Well, I think we could have done. We tried to course correct in the middle of the Parliament on some road schemes that we had cancelled, and then we reinstated, some of which have been built. But there's on the road. But I mean, without getting into, they just John Prescott cancelled a load of road schemes. Alistair Darling reinstated them. I cancelled them, then reinstated them. Then they got and I guess if you were looking for a kind of longer term decision making, you could try and get some kind of parliamentary consensus on road schemes or indeed rail schemes like HS2, where you need long time horizons, and you can't have every, particularly as there have been 7 chancellors since me, you can't have every chancellor cancelling the thing the last person did.
Okay, you and Yang briefly on this then.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add on this point about capital spend, Mr. Osborne, you mentioned in an interview that you regret the amount of capital cuts that you made during that period, and you mentioned just then that you attempted to course correct. Why was there the attempt to cut capital spending at a time when interest rates were almost zero, so you would have had effectively free money for the government to invest?
Well, I mean, so we were operating off essentially the baseline that we inherited from the late Alistair Darling, and he had built in plans to cut the deficit, which at the time was 11% of GDP, and he had a big cut in capital spending, and we in the coalition said we were actually doing better than what we'd inherited. But of course, with the passage of time...
But that's not what residents or...
No, of course, with the passage of time, you look back on it and you go... I mean, this is, a challenge which is sort of easier to see when you're outside Parliament than when you're in it. At the time, you think you're doing one better than the people who came before you and you're outfoxing your political opponents. But then you take a step back and go, well, maybe that just was the wrong thing and we should have totally rethought the capital budget. And then we definitely cancelled some things which we later had to reinstate, or wanted to reinstate, which obviously was not ideal. But I do think, even if we'd massively increased the capital budget, first of all, it would have put more pressure on current spending at a time when we had such a high budget deficit. It would also all put more pressure to raise taxes. And the borrowing, it's all very well saying zero interest rates or negative interest rates. At the time, a lot of our European neighbours were in fiscal crises. Greece,
we were in the euro at the time. But
yes,
I'll pass back.
No, but the Liz Truss mini budget, or the quasi-Kwarteng mini budget, and this Chancellor's experience twice in the last year, once when she was doing the budget and once a couple of months ago in Parliament, when it looked like she might quit, shows you how close Britain is to suddenly the market taking a different view.
I don't think she was looking to quit, just to be really clear.
No, but the market thought she might.
Okay, let's just be clear.
No, of course.
Yeah, I just want to be clear for the record. Sir Vince.
Well, I would confirm that. And this is something we did have quite a lot of strong internal debate about in the coalition, about why we couldn't borrow at low interest rates for investment. And the answer, I think, George has given, that what the advice we were getting from Treasury and our economic advisors was that the bond markets don't distinguish between capital and current spending. It's all borrowing. That was the argument that was thrown back at us. I think with hindsight, many things that the coalition did in fiscal policy that I strongly defend, even though they're unpopular. But I think this is one area where, with the benefit of hindsight, we could have taken a different track. But bear in mind the specifics. I mean, the one big public investment that was in front of us was HS2. I think it still accounts for half of public sector spending. I think when it came to our cabinet, the benefit cost ratio for HS2 was about 1.6 or something, which is barely credible. Then a subsequent government decided to do the low value part of the project rather than the high value part of the project. But we're not dealing with this in abstraction. We were dealing with real world problems in terms of borrowing and real world problems in terms of a limited range of projects, of which that was the biggest one.
I mean, remember, by the way, this was not nearly as tight or contractionary, as you put it, as almost all European countries were running at the time. And indeed, the United States of America, though it talked of fiscal stimulus under the Obama presidency, the truth was state governments were running contractionary fiscal policies across the United States. And in fact, the fiscal path of the UK and the US is almost identical during that period, if you look back on it. And the Obama administration and Larry Summers were talking about fiscal stimulus. We were talking about austerity or, getting the public finances in order. But in fact, we followed a pretty similar path, and it was milder than a lot of European countries were forced to follow. And I stand by the results, which was the fastest recovery of any of the G7 economies, the most jobs created of any parliament in British history, incomes of the poorest 20% rising faster than they'd done in the previous 10 years. I mean, lots of things I'd like to have done more with, but unfortunately this country had a vote on the EU.
Oh. Bobby Dean, MP.
Yeah, I want to take the long-run view as well. So we've talked about the bond markets, but of course they will respond to a variety of economic models. So there's no one pathway. It's just you need a credible plan. And I think, the coalition's plan was to weigh more heavily on spending cuts than tax rises. I think there was an 80-20 rule, or not a strict rule, but that was one of the things that was said. And given where we are now with the sort of social infrastructure, the foundations economy, you've mentioned the justice system, policing, there are lots of concerns about NHS and welfare state now. If you were to take a 25-year view, would you still make the same decisions, or would you weigh a little bit more heavily on the tax side to ensure that social infrastructure doesn't disintegrate? Can I come to you first, Sir Vince Cable?
Well, I think, within the coalition there wasn't a wide range of disagreement, but I think probably the Conservative colleagues would have preferred to lean more on spending and us to take a bit more out of tax, but we'd have been talking about 70-30 rather than 80-20. And I think one of the key factors which produced that coefficient was the fact that on the Lib Dem side, one of our priorities was to lift the threshold on low earners for income tax. So we were arguing for a substantial tax cut for people on low and middle income. So in a way, we contributed to that 80-20 mix that you describe. Can I just, it was the sort of introductory part of your question, just to make the point about, which I think we've missed a little bit in the discussion, about why Britain has this particular extreme vulnerability in bond markets. I mean, there's a mixture of factors. I mean, the United States is getting away with far more reckless policies than we would ever have dreamt with, because they have a global currency. We're not anchored in the Eurozone. And the shift away from final salary pension schemes mean that we don't have institutions which are trying to soak up government bonds in the way that the Japanese have. So we simply don't have the options that many other countries do to manage external public borrowing, and we're therefore particularly vulnerable.
Mr. Dean.
Mr. Osborne, do you want to respond to that point about the 25-year view of social infrastructure and whether or not we're weaker now because we lean too heavily on public spending cuts?
Well, I don't think that was the case back in 2010, 2015. What I would generally say is that, you don't have to run such a tight policy in peacetime, if you like, outside of the kind of aftermath of a financial crash, but you do need to require reform in return. And I would say, when you look at the justice system, I think if anyone's got experience of the court system, I think could ask legitimately, I keep hearing about it's all to do with money and inputs, I think you could legitimately ask the court system and the legal profession and the judiciary whether they might reform the way they handle themselves and in return for money. So I would, if I was the current government, I would do more kind of striking deals, which is we'll invest in return for reform. And that was, if you look at the kind of most successful period of the Blair government, Blair-Brown government, they were demanding reform in return for additional public expenditure.